February 21st, 1184. The frozen rice fields of Owazu. Steel clashes against steel in a losing rhythm. In the center of this carnage, the greatest samurai warrior of the age receives an order that will echo through 8 centuries of silence. Go, her lord commands. You are a woman. It would be unseemly. Not because she lacks skill. She has just defeated one of the enemy's strongest warriors with her bare hands, but because her very existence beside him in this final moment would shame him more than defeat itself. This is the story of Tomoe Gozen, a name that appears in the chronicles like a ghost. Brilliant, impossible, and then gone. A warrior whose skill was so legendary that even her enemies couldn't help but record it, while her own side tried to erase her from history entirely. But this isn't just a tale of a forgotten hero. It's about 2 people whose perfect partnership became an existential threat to the world they inhabited. A love so radical, so politically unforgivable, that it had to be destroyed. If these tales of impossible truths resonate with you, consider subscribing and let us know where you're listening from. I'm curious who else understands that the brightest legends are the ones buried in the deepest shadows. Now take a slow, deep breath. Settle into your cozier spot. Let the modern world fade away as we journey to the Genpei War, where a woman's strength was a crime and a perfection like hers was an unforgivable sin. The Genpei War was not a war in any modern sense. It was a 5-year hemorrhage that bled Japan white. From 1180 to 1185, the Taira and Minamoto clans tore the country apart in their struggle for supremacy. But this was no clean conflict between clearly defined armies. It was a roiling storm of shifting alliances, betrayed oaths, and burned temples. Monks became warriors, children became commanders, and the very foundations of the old aristocratic world crumbled like rice paper in rain. In this world of fluid loyalties and sudden death, honor wasn't a luxury, it was the only currency that mattered. A samurai's reputation was more precious than gold, more vital than land. It determined who would follow you, who would face you, and ultimately, whether your name would outlive your body. For men, the path to honor was clearly marked: skill with blade and bow, courage in battle, loyalty unto death. The rules were brutal but simple. For a woman, there were no rules because there wasn't supposed to be a game. Tomoe Gozen didn't just enter this game, she mastered it, and that mastery would prove to be both her glory and her doom. The chronicles describe her entrance into legend with the kind of awe usually reserved for natural disasters. A warrior worth 1,000, they called her, but this wasn't hyperbole born from a lover's bias. This was the assessment of enemies who had faced her and lived to tell of it. A rare enough feat. She wielded a bow that most men couldn't draw, swinging a sword that others could barely lift. When she rode into battle, hardened killers made space. But it wasn't just her physical prowess that set her apart. In an age when most samurai fought like rabid dogs, all fury and no thought, Tomoe brought something far more dangerous to the battlefield: a mind. Consider the Battle of Yokotagawara in 1181, one of her first major engagements. The historical record, thin as spider silk but persistent, places her at the front of Minamoto no Yoshinaka's forces. The enemy had superior numbers and held the high ground. By all conventional wisdom, a frontal assault was suicide. The other commanders urged caution, delay, perhaps negotiation. Tomoe saw something else. She noticed how the morning mist clung to the river valley, how it would hide movement until an army was almost upon you. She calculated the timing of the sunrise, when it would blind defenders looking east. She understood that the enemy's confidence in their position would make them lazy, unprepared for the impossible. At her suggestion, though the chronicles are careful never to credit her with actual command, Yoshinaka's forces moved through the pre-dawn darkness. They crossed the freezing river in silence, the men's teeth chattering not from cold but from terror of discovery. By the time the sun rose, they were already among the enemy's tents. The charge began in absolute silence. No war cries, no drums, just the whisper of steel leaving sheaths and the soft splash of horses emerging from the river mist, like nightmares given form. Tomoe led the vanguard, and in those first moments of contact, she became something more than human. The enemy sentries died before they could scream. Her blade found the gaps in their armour with an anatomist's precision. Behind her, Yoshinaka's men poured through the gap she created, but she was already moving deeper into the camp. The Taira soldiers woke to death walking among their tents. Some fumbled for weapons, others ran naked into the dawn, preferring the shame of flight to facing the demon that moved through their ranks like wind through wheat. Tomoe's sword work was economical to the point of artistry. No wasted motion, no excessive force. Just the minimum effort required to transform a living man into a corpse. One defender, a Taira captain still struggling into his armour, managed to raise his spear. She flowed around the thrust like water around stone, her blade opening his throat even as her free hand guided his falling weapon away from her horse. Another warrior, this one fully armed, tried to rally his men. She took his head so cleanly that his body stood for 3 more heartbeats, still gesturing commands to troops who were already fleeing. The sun rose on a battlefield that was less a fight than an abattoir. The mist turned red where it touched the ground, and the morning birds fell silent, as if nature itself recoiled from what she had wrought. By full daylight, the Taira camp was a graveyard, and Tomoe sat her horse in the centre of it, her armour painted with other men's blood, counting the heads worth taking. The slaughter was absolute. But here's where the story turns from triumph to prophecy. After the battle, as was customary, the victorious warriors presented their trophies. Samurai would carry the heads of notable enemies to their lord, each one proof of their valour, each one a rung on the ladder of reputation. Tomoe presented 3 heads, all of them commanders, all of them taken in single combat. The other samurai watched her approach Yoshinaka with these grisly trophies, and in their eyes she could read her future like tea leaves in blood. The man closest to her, a grizzled veteran named Amai Kanehira who had served the Minamoto for 20 years, took an involuntary step backward. His hand, the hand that had killed dozens without trembling, twitched toward his sword hilt, not to draw it, but the way a man touches a talisman against evil. She saw him swallow hard, his throat working like he was trying to digest something rotten. To her left, a group of younger samurai whispered among themselves, their voices carrying in the morning air despite their attempts at discretion. She caught fragments, unnatural. What kind of woman? Like something out of a nightmare. One of them, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, stared at her with the wide-eyed horror usually reserved for supernatural apparitions. The senior commanders were more controlled, but their control itself was telling. They stood perfectly still, faces carved from stone, but she could see the muscle jumping in Commander Higuchi's jaw, could see how Captain Tate's knuckles whitened as he gripped his warfan. These were men who had faced death 100 times, who had waded through rivers of blood without flinching. But watching her present those heads, watching a woman outperform them at the very art that defined their existence, shook them in a way no enemy army could. This silence stretched like a bowstring. No one congratulated her. No one slapped her shoulder or offered to share sake in celebration, as they did with each other. The space around her might as well have been a moat filled with poisoned water. And in that moment, standing before her lord with victory's proof in her hands and isolation settling on her shoulders like armour, Tomoe understood with perfect, terrible clarity what she'd become. She wasn't just better than them. She was a living refutation of everything they believed about the world. Her excellence didn't inspire them to greater heights. It made them smaller, made their own achievements seem childish by comparison. Every head she took something from them. Every impossible feat she accomplished made their possible ones worthless. She was not their comrade. She was their walking, breathing apocalypse. The thought settled in her mind with the weight of prophecy. They need me now, while the war rages. But the moment the last Tyra falls, I become the enemy they fear most, the one that threatens them from within. She understood in that moment, with the kind of crystal clarity that comes in the space between heartbeats, that her perfection was a double-edged blade. Every victory cut both ways. Every enemy she killed created two more among her allies. Every impossible feat she accomplished made her existence itself more impossible. A Chinese strategist once wrote that it is better to be feared than loved. He was wrong. Fear and love can coexist, but fear and need, that combination is poison, and the men around her needed her skills even as they feared what those skills represented. She could see it in how they spoke to her, never quite meeting her eyes, as if she were a blade they were afraid of cutting themselves on. She could feel it in the space they left around her in camp, close enough to show respect, far enough to avoid contamination. She could taste it in the sake they shared after battles, toasts that included her but were never quite to her. But Tomoe Gozen was not a woman given to self-pity. She had chosen this path with eyes wide open, knowing every step took her further from the world of women's quarters and silk screens and proper marriage negotiations. She'd picked up a blade knowing it would cut her off from everything soft and safe and acceptable. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't have known, was that her skill would make her not just an outsider, but an impossibility. A woman could be strong. There were stories of desperate mothers defending their children. A woman could even fight. History recorded the occasional female defender of castle walls, but a woman who was simply, undeniably, consistently better than the men around her. That was a violation of the natural order so profound that reality itself would have to be rewritten to exclude her. Years later, when the chroniclers came to record the tale of the Genpei War, they would face an impossible problem. How do you write about someone who shouldn't exist? How do you record victories won by an impossibility? How do you tell the truth when the truth itself is a kind of treason against the world you're trying to build? Their solution was elegant in its cruelty. They couldn't erase her entirely. Too many people had seen her, faced her, fled from her. But they could blur her edges, make her story a question rather than a statement. They could give her 3 different endings, each one contradicting the others, until no one could say for certain what became of the woman who was worth 1,000 warriors. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before she could be erased, she had to become too dangerous to remember, and that journey began not on a battlefield, but in a command tent, where she met the one man who would see her not as an impossibility, but as an equal. That partnership would shake the very foundations of the samurai world, and for that crime, both of them would pay the ultimate price. Minamoto no Yoshinaka was everything the refined courtiers of Kyoto despised, where they perfumed themselves with incense that cost more than a farmer's yearly harvest. He smelled of horse sweat and mountain pine, where they spent decades mastering the 31 syllables of courtly poetry. He spoke in the blunt declarations of a man who'd learned rhetoric at sword point. They called him Kiso no Yoshinaka, after his mountain domain. But the sneer in their voices made it clear they meant country bumpkin, barbarian, not one of us. They were right. He wasn't one of them, which is precisely why he could see Tomoe for what she was. Not an aberration to be corrected, but a weapon to be wielded. And perhaps, though neither would have admitted it in those early days, something more. Their partnership began as most things did in that brutal age, with calculation. Yoshinaka needed every advantage in his war against the Taira, and a warrior worth 1,000 was not an asset to be wasted on gender propriety. Tomoe needed a lord who would let her fight, who would see her skill rather than her sex. It should have been a simple arrangement. the crude warlord in his exotic weapon. But somewhere between the battles and the bloodshed, something shifted. The historical record, filtered through 8 centuries of discomfort, can't quite hide what happened. They try to minimize it, to frame her as just another concubine who happened to carry a sword, but the facts themselves rebel against this comfortable lie. Consider the evidence. Yoshinaka sent her out as his Ichiban no Taisho, his primary general, his first captain. This wasn't an honorary title or a lover's indulgence. In samurai hierarchy, your first captain led your most crucial assaults, planned your most vital strategies, held your war councils in your absence. To place a woman in this position wasn't just unusual, it was a complete repudiation of the natural order as every other samurai understood it. The war council before the Battle of Tonomiyama showed exactly what this meant in practice. The scene, as reported by survivors who fled to the capital with tales of the mountain army's strange ways, was unprecedented in samurai history. Yoshinaka's commanders had gathered in his tent, the air thick with incense meant to mask the stench of unwashed warriors. Maps painted on silk lay spread across low tables, marked with the positions of Taira forces. The discussion had reached an impasse. The enemy held a fortified position, and a frontal assault would be massacre. Then Tomoe spoke. She didn't whisper in Yoshinaka's ear like a proper concubine offering private counsel. She stood among the commanders and pointed to a narrow valley the maps barely showed, speaking with the authority of someone who expected to be heard. The monks who recorded this scene decades later could barely bring themselves to describe it. A woman, in full armour, contradicting senior commanders who had been fighting since before she was born. Commander Endo, a man who had served Yoshinaka's father, responded the way any traditional samurai would. He laughed, the harsh bark of a man witnessing the impossible. He asked if they were now taking counsel from their horses as well, since apparently all natural order had been abandoned. The tent fell silent. The insult hung in the air like a drawn blade. Yoshinaka's response defined their partnership for every man present. He didn't defend her. He didn't need to. He simply asked Endo how many heads he had taken at their last battle. Then he asked Tomoe the same question. The numbers spoke louder than any argument. Endo had taken 2. Tomoe had taken 5. Yoshinaka turned back to the map and asked her to continue explaining her plan. The shock that rippled through the tent was almost physical. She wasn't just permitted to speak. She was given precedence over men who had been born to command. When she finished outlining her strategy, a night march through the valley to strike the Taira supply lines, Yoshinaka didn't deliberate. He simply nodded and began issuing orders to implement her plan. 3 commanders requested private audiences with Yoshinaka that night. 3 commanders were told that his general's plans were not subject to debate. By morning, 2 of those commanders had sent messages to their relatives serving under Minamoto no Yoritomo in the east. The messages varied in wording but not in substance. Their cousin Yoshinaka had been bewitched. A she-demon rode at his side, speaking with a man's authority, fighting with a demon's strength. The natural order had been overturned. Something had to be done. The whispers spread through the army like plague through a siege camp. They called her Onibaba, demon hag, though she was young and beautiful. They said she had bewitched Yoshinaka with sexual sorcery, though anyone who watched them plan battles could see it was her strategic mind he valued as much as her sword arm. They claimed she drank the blood of her enemies, that she could not be killed by mortal weapons, that she had sold her womanhood to dark forces in exchange for martial prowess. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, but they all served the same purpose, to explain the unexplainable. How else could a woman stand as a man's equal in council and exceed him on the battlefield unless dark forces were involved? These tales reached Kyoto long before Yoshinaka's army did. Court ladies whispered behind their fans about the mountain lord and his unnatural companion. Ministers debated in careful euphemisms about what this meant for the future of the realm. If Yoshinaka took the capital, Would he elevate his she-general to an official position? Would other women see her example and begin to question their own places? But more importantly, the stories reached Kamakura, where Minamoto no Yoritomo was building his vision of a new Japan. His advisors, men like Kajiwara Kagetoki, who prided themselves on their political acumen, saw the danger immediately. It wasn't just that Yoshinaka had a female warrior that could be dismissed as an eccentricity. It was that he treated her as an equal, and worse, that she proved worthy of that treatment. If this precedent stands, Kagetoki reportedly told Yoritomo, in 10 years, we'll have women demanding to inherit their father's swords along with their brothers. In 20, they'll want to hold land in their own names. In 30, they'll be sitting in councils of war, speaking as if their opinions matter. Yoritomo, ever the pragmatist, understood that some threats were military and others were ideological. Yoshinaka's victories made him a military rival, but his partnership with Tomoe made him an existential threat to the very structure of the society Yoritomo intended to build. The order went out, wrapped in the language of family concern and political necessity. Yoshinaka must be brought to heel, and his unnatural attachment to the warrior woman must be severed, one way or another. But first came Kurikara, where that partnership would achieve its greatest triumph. The Battle of Kurikara in 1183 showed their partnership at its most devastating. The Taira had assembled a massive force, some say 100,000 strong, though chroniclers had a habit of inflating numbers like fishermen with tales of the one that got away. What matters is that Yoshinaka's forces were vastly outnumbered. A conventional assault would have been massacre. But Yoshinaka and Tomoe didn't think conventionally. The plan they devised was audacious in its simplicity. While Yoshinaka's main force created a distraction with war drums and battle cries, Tomoe led a picked force of mounted samurai on a brutal march through mountain paths the Taira believed impassable. For 2 days, her men climbed paths better suited to mountain goats than horses, sustained only by cold rice and the promise of glory. On the night of the attack, they struck the Taira camp from behind while Yoshinaka assaulted from the front. But the masterstroke came from Tomoe herself. She had noticed during their mountain passage that the local herders used fire to drive their cattle. The Taira camp, positioned in a valley, would funnel panic like a throat funnels a scream. The historical accounts struggle with what happened next. They want to give Yoshinaka credit for the victory, but they can't quite erase the image. Tomoe silhouetted against a wall of flame, driving hundreds of maddened cattle into the Taira ranks. The animals, terrified by the fire at their backs and the clash of arms ahead, became living battering rams. The Taira lines dissolved into chaos. Men were trampled, gored, knocked into the river where the weight of their armour dragged them down. The slaughter was so complete that the river ran red for 3 days. The Kurikara Pass became known as the Hell Valley, and Yoshinaka's reputation as an unstoppable force was sealed. But here's what the chronicles try to hide. It was Tomoe who was unstoppable. Yoshinaka provided the stage, but she was the performance. In the aftermath of Kurikara, something unprecedented happened. The captured Taira warriors, when asked about the battle, spoke of Tomoe with something approaching reverence. These were men raised to believe that women were pollution on the battlefield, that even the sight of one would curse a warrior's sword. Yet they described her charge through their ranks with the kind of awe usually reserved for natural disasters or divine intervention. One captured Taira general, before his execution, supposedly said, "I have faced the Minamoto Lord and his she-demon. I'm no longer sure which one I should have feared more." This was the heart of the scandal. It wasn't just that Yoshinaka had a female warrior. Eccentric lords had done stranger things. It was that he treated her as an equal, and worse, that she proved worthy of that treatment. Every victory they shared was a crack in the foundation of the world the samurai were trying to build. The conservative Minamoto leadership back in Kamakura watched these reports with growing alarm. Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshinaka's cousin and rival for clan leadership, understood power in a way Yoshinaka never would. Yoritomo was building something new, a military government that would rule Japan for the next 7 centuries. This bakufu needed clear hierarchies, defined roles, absolute order. A female general commanding armies didn't fit into this vision. A lord who saw his woman as a partner rather than property was even worse. If Yoshinaka's model spread, if other ambitious women saw what Tomoe had achieved and decided to reach for swords instead of sewing needles, the entire structure Yoritomo envisioned would collapse before it began. The whispers began almost immediately. Yoshinaka has been bewitched, they said. The woman has unmanned him with dark magic. No true samurai would submit to female guidance. The calumnies were as predictable as they were effective. Every victory Yoshinaka won with Tomoe at his side became proof not of his strength, but of his perversion of the natural order. But in those glorious months after Kurikara, as they rode toward Kyoto on a wave of Taira blood, Yoshinaka and Tomoe seemed untouchable. They had each found in the other the only person in Japan who understood them completely. He saw her not as a woman playing at war, but as the purest expression of the warrior spirit he'd ever encountered. She saw him not as a crude mountain lord, but as the only man brave enough to recognize what she was. The author of the Heike Monogatari, writing decades later from the safety of historical distance, would struggle to explain their relationship. The text calls her his milk sister, suggesting they were raised together, trying to frame their intimacy as familial rather than romantic. Then it calls her his concubine, trying to minimize her to a sexual role, but it can't hide the most damning evidence of all. On the battlefield, they moved as one mind in 2 bodies. That unity would carry them to the gates of Kyoto itself. The Taira, broken and demoralized, fled the capital rather than face Yoshinaka's army. The city that had sneered at the mountain lord now opened its gates to him. He entered not as a beggar seeking legitimacy, but as a conqueror demanding submission. It should have been their moment of triumph. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Because Kyoto was a different kind of battlefield, one where Yoshinaka's mountain pragmatism became a liability, and where Tomoe's existence went from being merely scandalous to actively dangerous. The capital was full of eyes that saw too much and tongues that whispered in all the right ears, and watching from the east, Minamoto no Yoritomo decided that his cousin's radical partnership had to end. The revolution they represented, a world where merit mattered more than gender, where partnership could transcend tradition, was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The order for their destruction had already been given. All that remained was to find the right battlefield to carry it out. The end came wrapped in the bitter gift of family loyalty. By January of 1184, Yoshinaka's position in Kyoto had become untenable. His mountain warriors, men who understood conquest but not occupation, had turned the capital into their personal playground. They took what they wanted, insulted whom they pleased, and treated the elaborate protocols of court life with the respect a butcher shows a silk kimono. The retired Emperor Go Shirakawa, that master manipulator who had played every faction against each other for 40 years, saw his opportunity. He sent secret messages to Minamoto no Yoritomo. "Your cousin has become a tyrant. Come save us from this mountain demon and his she-devil general." Yoritomo didn't need to be asked twice. He dispatched his brothers, Noriyori and Yoshitsune, with an army that dwarfed anything Yoshinaka could muster. The pretense was to restore order. The reality was fratricide, sanctified by political necessity. Yoshinaka and Tomoe fought a brilliant retreating action through the winter of 1184. Every ambush was perfectly placed, every defensive position maximized for carnage. They made Yoritomo's forces pay in blood for every mile, but the arithmetic of war is inexorable. They were outnumbered 10 to 1, and every samurai they lost was irreplaceable. By the morning of February 21st, they had been driven to Owazu, a frozen marshland outside the capital. Yoshinaka's army had been whittled down to a handful. The chronicles differ on the exact number. Some say 30, some say 7. What matters is that everyone knew this was the end. In samurai culture, there was honor in a last stand. To die with your lord, sword in hand, was the highest expression of loyalty. It transformed defeat into a kind of victory, temporal failure into eternal glory. Every man with Yoshinaka that morning expected to claim that honor. Tomoe expected it too. She had lived as his equal, fought as his partner, loved as his other half. To die beside him would be the perfect ending to their impossible story, which is why what happened next cut deeper than any blade. As the enemy closed in, Yoshinaka turned to her. The man who had treated her as an equal in all things now looked at her with eyes full of an emotion she had never seen from him before. Shame. The chronicles record his words, though they can't capture the agony that must have accompanied them. He told her to leave. She was a woman, he said, and it would be unseemly for him to die with a woman at his side. The shame would taint his death, make it a matter of mockery rather than honor. The words came out broken, like a man speaking around a blade in his throat. She could see the war raging behind his eyes, not against the approaching enemy, but against himself. This was Yoshinaka trapped in his own private hell. Every instinct screamed at him to keep her close, to die as they had lived, as partners, as equals, as two halves of the same warrior soul. He wanted to tell her to stay, to draw her sword and make their last stand together. She could see it in the way his hand reached toward her, then fell back like it had been burned. But stronger than love, stronger than loyalty, stronger even than his own revolutionary beliefs, was the chain of conditioning wrapped around his warrior's heart. The voices of every teacher, every father, every ancestor whispered in his ears. A samurai's death must be pure. A woman's presence pollutes. Your name will be a joke. Your death will be dishonored. Everything you fought for will be undermined by this final shame. He was trying to save her. She could see that too. In his mind, twisted by the contradictions of their world, sending her away was an act of love. If she stayed and died with him, she would be remembered only as the woman who tainted a great lord's death. If she fled, she might live. She might find another path. She might... The thought died unfinished. They both knew there was no other path for her. She had burned every bridge the moment she picked up a sword. But he was drowning in his own paradox. The code he had defied his whole life now had its hooks in him when it mattered most, and he could no more resist it than he could stop breathing. For Tomoe, the words hit like a physical blow. She actually swayed in her saddle, and for a moment, just a moment, the battlefield sounds faded to nothing. The approaching enemy, the clash of steel, the screams of the dying, all of it vanished. There was only Yoshinaka's face and the words that unmade everything they had built together. This wasn't just a commander dismissing a subordinate or a man protecting his lover. This was the person who had seen her truly. The only person in all of Japan who had looked at her and seen a warrior instead of an aberration. Now seeing her through the world's eyes, as a woman first, as a warrior second, as someone whose presence polluted rather than purified. The betrayal was absolute, not because he was sending her away. Death held no terror for someone who had dealt it so liberally, but because in his final moment, the mountain lord who had defied convention at every turn was kneeling before it. The man who had made her his first captain, who had given her command of armies, who had loved her as an equal, was now ashamed to die beside her. She felt something break inside her chest, not her heart. That was too simple a word for what shattered. It was the foundation of everything she had believed about their partnership, about the possibility of being judged by merit rather than anatomy, about the war they had been fighting against tradition itself. All of it crumbled in the space between one breath and the next. The worst part was that she understood. She could see the societal knife at his throat as clearly as he could. If she stayed and they died together, every victory they had won would be reframed as the result of seduction and sorcery. Their partnership would become proof that women corrupted men, weakened them, led them to destruction. His name would become a cautionary tale, and hers would be the poison that killed him. But understanding didn't diminish the rage that flooded through her veins like molten metal. This was the final insult the world would deal her. To be dismissed from her own death by the one person who had ever truly seen her. To be saved against her will, preserved like some delicate treasure when all she had ever wanted was to be tested and found worthy. She could have refused, could have drawn her sword and made her stand regardless of his orders. But that would have given their enemies exactly what they wanted. Proof that she was an uncontrolled element, a mad dog that even Yoshinaka couldn't leash. It would have retroactively justified every slander, every whisper about bewitchment and perversion. So she made a different choice. If he needed her to leave, she would leave. But first, she would remind everyone present, including him, exactly what he was casting aside. The rage crystallized into something colder, harder, more precise than any blade. She would give him what he wanted, a death untainted by her female presence. But she would also give him something else, a final demonstration of what he was losing. Not a lover's goodbye, but a warrior's farewell written in blood. The chronicles describe what happened next with the kind of precise detail that suggests even Yoshinaka's enemies were impressed. Onda no Hachiro Moroshige of Musashi was renowned as one of the strongest warriors in Japan, a man who had never met his match in single combat. Tomoe rode straight at him. The physics of what happened next shouldn't have been possible. Moroshige was a giant of a man in full armour. Tomoe, for all her skill, was still constrained by the basic realities of female musculature. But she had spent years perfecting techniques that turned her opponent's strength against them, that made momentum and leverage more important than raw power. She let Moroshige think he had her, allowed him to close in for what he thought would be an easy grapple. Then, using her horse's motion and his own overconfidence, she twisted in her saddle, caught him in a grip that turned his armour from protection to prison, and finished him in one decisive motion with the kind of brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. She threw the head at Yoshinaka's feet, not as a trophy, but as a statement. This is what you're losing. This is what you're telling to run away. This is what you're ashamed to die beside. The head rolled to a stop in the mud between them. Their eyes met one last time across that grisly punctuation mark. In his face, she saw agony and comprehension. He understood what she was telling him. In hers, he saw the death of everything they had been to each other, a clean and final severance more complete than any blade could achieve. Then, without a word, she rode from the field. The historical record loses her here. 3 different endings appear in 3 different texts, each one trying to contain her, to force her into a box that makes sense. She became a nun. One version says, living to 91 and praying for Yoshinaka's soul. She was captured and made a concubine, says another, her warrior spirit finally tamed by forced domesticity. She killed herself, claims a third, walking into the sea in full armour. All 3 are lies. We know they're lies because if any were true, there would be evidence, a grave, a death poem, a record of her capture. Something. Instead, there's nothing but silence and contradiction. The truth is simpler and more damning. She escaped. She vanished into the fog of war and the chroniclers, unable to track her, unable to capture her even in words. Gave her the only endings they could imagine. Endings that made her safe. Endings that put her back in a woman's place. But their inability to agree on a lie tells its own truth. Tomoe Gozen was too dangerous to remember accurately. Her real ending, whatever it was, threatened the narrative Yoritomo was building, so they buried her in conflicting stories, hoping that the confusion would be as good as erasure. As for Yoshinaka, his end came quickly, riding alone, seeking the clean death that would wash away the shame of living with an equal. He found only bathos. His horse became mired in a frozen rice paddy. While he struggled to free himself, an arrow took him in the face. He died stuck in the mud, unhorsed and unheroic, as if the universe itself was punishing him for his final hypocrisy. The poet-warrior who had conquered half of Japan, who had dared to love a woman as a partner rather than a possession, died like a fool in a farmer's field. There was no honour in it, no glory, just mud and blood and the cosmic joke of a man destroyed by the very system he'd tried to transcend. But perhaps that was always the only ending their story could have. In a world built on beautiful lies, the truth itself becomes a kind of treason. So what became of Tomoe Gozen? The answer depends on which lie you find most comforting. The first lie, that she became a nun, is for those who need redemption in their stories. It transforms the warrior into a woman of faith, the sword into a prayer bead, the battlefield into a meditation hall. It's a comfortable lie because it suggests that even the most radical woman will eventually return to acceptability, that given enough time and Buddhism, any female can be domesticated. The second lie, that she was captured and made a concubine, is for those who need the world to make sense. It insists that no woman, no matter how skilled, can escape the fundamental reality of male dominance. She may have played at being a warrior, this lie says, but in the end, biology is destiny. She ended where all women end, in a man's bed, bearing his children. Her sword-calloused hands finally put to their proper use. The third lie, that she committed suicide, is for the romantics. It preserves her warrior's honour while still removing her from the board. She dies undefeated, technically, but still dies. It's the kind of ending that makes for beautiful poetry and disturbing no one's sleep. But the very fact that 3 different lies exist tells us the truth. They don't know what happened to her. The greatest female warrior in Japanese history vanished like smoke, and the chroniclers, those careful men who recorded every minor samurai's death haiku, somehow lost track of her entirely. This isn't carelessness, this is terror. They couldn't find her because they couldn't conceive of her. Their world had no place for a woman who was simply better than the men around her, who had proven it in battle after battle, who had been recognised as an equal by one of the great lords of the age. To acknowledge her true ending, whatever it was, would have been to acknowledge that their entire worldview was false. So they gave her 3 endings, hoping one would stick, like throwing mud at a ghost. The most telling detail is what's missing. Every samurai of note has a grave, a memorial, a death poem. Even Yoshinaka, the failed rebel, has his tomb at Gichuji Temple. Pilgrims still visit, still leave offerings for the mountain lord who died in the mud. But Tomoe? Nothing. No grave, no memorial, no death poem. It's as if she never existed at all, except she did exist. We know because even her enemies couldn't help but record her victories. The Taira Chronicles, written by the losers, mention her with more clarity than the Minamoto histories written by the winners. They had no reason to invent a female enemy who humiliated their best warriors, which means every mention of her in their records is an admission of defeat. The Heike Monogatari itself, for all its poetic embellishment, can't hide the raw facts. A woman rode to war, she commanded armies, she killed champions, she was loved as an equal by a man who treated that love as a political statement, and when the world demanded she be erased, she refused to cooperate by dying conveniently. The blind monks who chanted her story in the decades that followed must have struggled with the cognitive dissonance. Here was a tale that insisted on its own impossibility. A woman who was exactly what a samurai should be. Brave, skilled, loyal, except for the unforgivable accident of her gender. They sang her story because it was too powerful to ignore, but they sang it as a question rather than an answer. The new bakufu that Yoritomo built would last almost 7 centuries. It would codify the position of women as domestic ornaments, valuable for alliances and breeding, but excluded from public life. The female inheritance rights of the Heian period would vanish like morning dew. The very idea of a woman wielding political or military power would become not just unusual but unthinkable. This was Yoritomo's true victory, not just defeating Yoshinaka, but defeating the idea that Yoshinaka and Tomoe represented, the possibility of partnership, the radical notion that merit mattered more than gender, the dangerous thought that the world could be different than it was. But ghosts have a way of haunting those who try to bury them. Tomoe's name survived the erasure. Her story, fractured and contradictory as it is, still troubles the neat narrative of samurai masculinity. She remains a question mark in the official history, a woman-shaped hole in the comfortable lie. 8 centuries later, we're still arguing about her, still trying to make her fit into boxes she spent her life cutting her way out of. Was she real? Was she myth? Was she Yoshinaka's lover or just his retainer? The questions themselves missed the point. She was a woman who picked up a sword in a world that said she couldn't. She was so good with it that history itself had to be rewritten around her absence. That's not mythology. That's revolution. And maybe that's why her ghost still won't rest. In a world still struggling with the radical idea that women might be equals, Tomoe Gozen remains relevant. She's the warrior who won every battle except the last one, the battle to be remembered as she was, rather than as others needed her to be. But in trying to erase her, they achieved the opposite. They made her immortal. Not as a person with a grave to visit, but as an idea too dangerous to die. The impossible woman, the partnership that threatened an empire, the love that was also a war. She haunts the margins of history, forever riding away from that final battlefield, forever refusing to give us the comfortable ending we crave. Neither nun nor concubine nor suicide, just a woman on a horse, disappearing into the morning mist, leaving behind only questions and the faint sound of a system cracking under the weight of its own lies. Some legends are lies that reveal the truth. Others are truths too dangerous to be anything but legend. Tomoe Gozen was both. Rest now, in the quiet after a story of swords and shadows. Rest, knowing that some warriors are too fierce for death, too dangerous for memory, too true for the histories written by frightened men. They live on in the silence between the official lines, in the ghost stories we tell ourselves about the world that might have been.